So welcome back to managerial accounting. And now we're into objective number 2. We want to prepare a cost of production report. And this is frankly the most difficult and challenging topic in chapter 3, and may indeed be one of the most challenging topics in the course. And we've got a number of things going on here. We've got the different types of inventory, raw materials, work in process, finished goods. Also, we have the fact that we have to simultaneously consider the costs incurred, and then we also have to allocate those costs amongst 3 different buckets in terms of how much has been transferred out. What are the costs that have been transferred out to the other department? What is the value of the ending work in process? And what's the value of the beginning inventory? So this is what gets us into the equivalent units. So if we are manufacturing ice cream here, and we're manufacturing 5,000 gallons, that doesn't mean that when it comes to conversion costs, that we've got 5,000 gallons of costs to consider, because some of the work would have been done in the previous period in work in process, some of the work is done in this period. Same thing with the ending inventory. If the ending inventory is 30% complete, then you don't have 5,000 units ending inventory. The equivalent units is only 1,500, or 30% of 5,000. So this is a tricky topic. To try to keep it simple, we're going to use first in, first out, which we're going to assume that the flow of the cost is going to be, we're going to we're going to make the assumption that the beginning inventory goes out first. So we're going to accumulate all the costs. So look here, in terms of the total production cost that we have to account for is $90,000. But of that $90,000, how much of that is transferred to out of this department into the packaging department, and how much of it is still left on hand at the end of the period? And in order to do that, to make that allocation, we have to get into what are called the equivalent units. So let's take a deeper look at equivalent units. So first step is we have to figure out the number of units that have to be assigned costs. So we know we had 5,000 gallons of inventory direct materials cost at the beginning of the period. And we know that we had materials costs that were added. We had 60,000 gallons worth of materials. So we've got 65,000 gallons to account for. So that is the gallons that we had at the beginning of the period, plus the gallons that were transferred into this department from materials stored. So we've got 65,000 gallons. So the question is, how do we allocate the cost associated with those 65,000 gallons, which is 90,000? How do we allocate that to the beginning inventory, to the goods that were transferred out, and to the ending? So first thing we've got to do is we've got to actually take a look at those 65,000 gallons there and say, what is the, we're going to allocate them to one of 3 places. They're going to go to the beginning inventory, the units that were completed during the month of July, and the units that were on hand at the end of the period. So we know we had 5,000 units that were gallons that were on hand at the beginning of the period. We know that we started and completed 57,000 units. And so we transferred out to the packaging department 62,000 units, and we've got 3,000 units or 3,000 gallons at the end of the period. So that's how we allocate the 65,000 gallons. 65,000 gallons is the total amount of gallons. We allocate that into 3 groups: the beginning inventory, which was the stuff that was on hand at the beginning of the period; the stuff that was started and completed, which is 57,000. Okay. So by the way, if you ever get the amount that's been transferred out and you need to figure out the amount that was started and completed during the month, just take the amount that was transferred out and subtract out the beginning inventory. So we've got to allocate now these costs amongst these 65 gallons, these 65,000 gallons. So here's now we've got the information that we need to go ahead and accumulate to calculate what we call equivalent units. So although we've got 65,000 gallons to account for, those 65,000 gallons, which we're going to use to allocate the costs, we're going to end up in 3 different buckets. So here graphically is what it looks like. We had 5,000 gallons in beginning inventory. We added 57,000 gallons, and we had 3,000 at the end of the period. So the total amount that we have to assign cost to is 62,000. But the gallons that were actually started and completed in July were started and completed was this 57,000 and then you had 3,000 that was started but not completed. So you have 60,000 that was started, but of those 60,000, only 57,000 were actually completed. Okay. So let's take what we've just learned now, and let's pause, and let's go take a look at exercise 2 on page 124. So pause the tape and go to exercise 2 on page 124, and I will see you there shortly. Don't just wait for the explanation. Remember, the wine must suffer on the vine. So do a little bit of suffering here. Okay, so what do we have here? So we've got two departments. The filling department received 45,000 ounces from the blending department. During the period, the filling department completed 42,800 ounces, including 4,000 ounces of work in process at the beginning of the period. The ending work in process was 6,200. How many ounces were started and completed? Well, remember that little graphic that we did here. So during the period, we completed 42,800 ounces, but that included 4,000 worth of ounces that were in work in process at the beginning of the period. So in terms of the number that were started and completed, it would be the amount that were, you completed 42,800, but 4,000 of those would have come out of beginning inventory. So your correct answer there is 38,800. How did I get that? I got 42,800 that were completed, and I subtracted out the beginning inventory of 4,000. So that gives me 38,800 that were started and completed. Good. So I hope you struggled on your own, and then can follow my rationale in the solution. All right. So let's go to a different place here. Let me go back and share my screen. Okay, so now we are going to do what we call we're going to actually go ahead and start to prepare a production report. And to do this, I'm going to have to figure out the equivalent units of materials. I'm going to have to figure out the equivalent units of conversion costs, and then I'm going to have to make an allocation of those to the various components of inventory. So whole units are the number of units in production during the period. So in the case of our example here that we did earlier, we had 65,000 that were in production, but that doesn't mean that those were the equivalent units. It's the portion of the whole units that are complete with respect to materials and conversion costs. So we make an assumption here. If we assume that materials were added at the beginning of the process, if we look at the end of the month and we've got a 1,000 gallon batch of ice cream, in terms of equivalent units, that means that we've got of materials costs, since materials are added at the beginning of the period, we've got 1,000 gallons of material that we need to account for, that is resident in that inventory. However, not so with the conversion. They say that the conversion, the batch is only 40% complete with regard to conversion costs. So if you've got 1,000 units in inventory and they're only 40% complete, for equivalent units, you only have 400. Notice the difference. If we've got materials added at the beginning of the period, then the equivalent units for material is the amount that is number of gallons on hand, because the materials are added at the beginning of the period. But when it comes to conversion cost, the conversion cost for the current period is only the percentage of the work done in the current period. So if you had 1,000 units in inventory, but they were only 40% complete, the equivalent units is only 400. So let's get a look at an example here, and let's actually compute the equivalent units of material for Frozen Delight. So Frozen Delight had 5,000 units on hand at the beginning of the period. So if those were added at the beginning of the period, and it's carryover inventory, so that's stuff that must have been carried over for June. As far as work done this period, there are no equivalent units that have been added to that beginning inventory of the material. With regards to that which was started and completed, if we started and completed 57,000 units, how do we get that? We've got the started 62,000. We subtract out the ending inventory there. And what we've got is that we've got 57,000 units. So with regard to materials cost, 100% of those are equivalent units, because all that, since it was added at the beginning of the period, it's 100% of the 57,000. And then as far as the inventory on hand at the end of the period, if we've got 3,000 gallons on hand at the end of the period, again, materials are added at the beginning of the process, so they are 100% complete. So notice what we've got here. So the equivalent units for material this period is not 65,000, it's 60,000. How did we get that? Well, the beginning inventory, no additional materials were added to those. The started and completed, 100% for materials. And with regard to the ending inventory of 3,000, also 100% worth materials. So look at it graphically here. So we know that we have 65,000 gallons to account for. That 5,000, that was from the beginning inventory. So in terms of equivalent units done this period, the 5,000 is a carryover from the previous period. So the equivalent units this period is the 57,000 that were actually started and completed, and the 3,000 that is in an inventory. So let's take a pause here and let's do exercise 3 on page 124. And remember, the grapes must suffer for there to be good wine. So take a look at exercise 3. Okay, so here we are with exercise 3. And where it says the Lilac Company had 4,000 units in beginning work in process, of which 70% were complete. During the period, 42,800 ounces were completed. The ending work in process was 6,200 ounces, which were 40% complete. What are the total equivalent units for material if materials are rated at the beginning of the process? So we can always assume materials are rated at the beginning of the process. So as far as equivalent units, the 4,000 that was in beginning inventory, no equivalent units. The percentage of work that was done this period with regard to materials would be 0%. During the period, 42,800 were completed. Well, if 42,800 were completed and you had 4,000 that were in beginning inventory, that must mean that the started and completed during the period was 38,800. And if they're started and completed, those particular units with regard to material would be 100% complete. And if you've got 6,200 units in the ending work in process and materials are rated at the end of the period, those 6,200 units are fully complete with regard to materials. So if you tie that all together, do this little chart here. So the beginning work in process, there was no percentage of material added this period. The 38,800 started and completed, which was the unit started of 42,800 minus the stuff that was left on hand at the end of the period, 4,000. 38,800 started and completed, that's 100%. And the ending work in process of 6,200 gallons, again, since materials are rated at the end of the beginning of the process, they're 100% complete as well. So the equivalent units here is 45,000 with regard to material. Now that's with regard to material. We're going to get a very different answer with regard to conversion costs. And then we're going to have to tie this stuff all together when we do a actual preparation of the total costs. So let's stop here. Hopefully you found that explanation useful. And let's go back to our lecture. Okay, conversion with regard to equivalent units. Equivalent units are, again, going to be the amount of work that was done during the period. So your beginning work in process, you had 5,000 units that at the beginning of the period were 70% complete. So with regard to 30 of the conversion cost, that means 30% of the work must have been done in the month of July. 5,000 times 30% gives me 1,500. Started and completed, started and completed. That was still 57,000. So those are 100% complete with regard to conversion costs. And now the ending work in process, the ending work in process is 25% complete. So 25% of 3,000 gives me 750. So the equivalent units for conversion costs here are 59,250. And that is made up of 1,500 equivalent units for the beginning work in process, because we had to add another 30% completed. That's 100% with regard to the stuff that was started and completed this period. And only 25% of the 3,000 units that were on hand at the end of the period is work in process, 59,250. So you can look at this graphically. So the total equivalent units for this period, just focusing on the middle here, the 30% of the additional work that you had to do on the beginning work in process of 1,500, the 57,000 that was started and completed this period, and the 750 units, you had to add 25% of those to actually complete those this period. So there's your additional 750. Okay. And the 75% of the work that needed to be done to complete these things is going to be done in the next period, which is going to be August. Right? So again, let's stop. Let's take a look at the exercise 4. Exercise 4, you're going to do conversion costs. So you're going to have a schedule that looks similar to materials cost, but they're going to be different percentages. And we'll see that momentarily. So take a pause. And now let's take a look at exercise 4. Okay, exercise 4. So you had 4,000 units in beginning work in process. That was 70% complete. Well, what that means to you, if it was 70% complete last period, we can assume on the first in, first out that 30% of the work would have been done this period. So when it comes to those equivalent units for the beginning work in process, the 4,000 is going to be 30%. 42,800 were completed, and we know that 42,800 were completed, but we know there were 4,000 units in beginning inventory, so that must mean that 38,800 were started and completed. And the ending work in process has got 6,200 units, which was 40% complete this period. So let's go ahead now and show you, and again, hopefully you struggle with this on your own. Let's come up with the equivalent units for conversion costs. So the beginning work in process was 4,000 units. So 30%, if it was 70% complete last period, you can assume it was 30% complete this period. We started and completed, which was 38,800, 100% complete with regard to conversion costs. And then the ending work in process, you had 62,000 units, but they were only 40% complete. So the total equivalent units here is 42,480. And notice that equivalent units for materials was 45,000, and the materials units for conversion costs was 42,480. These things will normally be different. If the two of them are exactly the same, there's something screwy going on. Okay. They would only be the same if you had no beginning and ending work in process. All right, let's go back. And let's see if we can tie these all together. Now that we know what the equivalent units are, we can come up with the actual amount per ounce for materials and the amount per ounce for conversion costs. Okay. So to get the total direct materials cost per equivalent units, you've got the total direct materials cost, and we know the equivalent units we calculated already at 60,000. And the conversion cost we calculated already at 59,250. So if we can come up with the total materials cost for the period, we can come up with the material cost per equivalent unit and use that to allocate the materials cost in terms of those three buckets that we talked about earlier. And with regard to conversion cost, same thing. If we can get the total conversion cost for the period divided by the equivalent units, then we know what value to assign to each of those three buckets. So here goes. Here is the material, the beginning inventory, the direct materials and conversion costs that were actually incurred this period. We had $66,000 worth of materials, and we had $83,750 of conversion costs, which were the total of direct labor and factory overhead. So to get the unit cost, there's my direct materials are 66,000. And we know for materials, we had 60,000 units. So 66,000 divided by 60,000 gallons. So direct materials cost per equivalent unit is $1.10. And we know the total conversion costs, if we go back, total conversion costs were $17,725. And I know my conversion cost equivalent units was 59,250. So I get a conversion cost per equivalent unit of 30 cents per gallon. Right. Now we can use those to do the allocation now. It says the total production costs incurred by frozen delight in July are as follows. So there's my beginning inventory of 62,225. There is my materials, there is my labor, there is my factory overhead, there is the total production cost that we have to account for, is that 90,000. Now notice all the little question marks. How much of that is allocated to beginning inventory? How much of that is started and completed? How much of that is transferred out? And how much is in ending work in process? Well, if you've got the whole units, now you've got to use the equivalent units, and you multiply the equivalent units by the unit cost. So with regard to the beginning work in process, we had 6,225 worth of total costs that were in there. And as far as work done this period, there were no materials that were added this period. But with regard to conversion costs, we had 1,500 worth of equivalent units. Multiply that by 30 cents, you get 450. So the total cost for the work in process beginning inventory is $6,675. Then as far as the units that were started and completed this period, there were 57,000 times $1.10. That's the total materials costs incurred. And the total conversion costs were 57,000 times 30 cents, which gives me the 17.1. So the total of cost transferred to the packaging department in the month of July would be the beginning work in process plus the cost of the goods started and completed in July, which was 79. So the total amount that's transferred to the packaging department is 86,475. Now, as far as what's in work in process at the end of the period, we got 3,000 gallons, fully complete with regard to material, and only 30% complete with regard to conversion costs. So now we can see what the total allocation is. So the beginning work in process, those costs are 67,500. Started and completed is 79,800. The ending work in process is 3,525. And there's the allocation of my $90,000. So that's how we use the equivalent units to actually, remember, the costs have to be allocated into three places. The cost of the beginning work in process, the cost group 2 would be the started and completed costs, and group 3 would be the inventory on hand at the end of the period. So we can put those all together. This is kind of a small little, it's hard to read this slide here, but this shows up above the whole units, which was really equivalent to exercise 1. Then we did the equivalent units and the equivalent units for materials, the equivalent units for conversion costs. Then we got the total conversion cost per unit, and then the costs assigned to both the beginning inventory and the cost incurred in July. So these are the total costs that have to be allocated amongst the to the mixing department. And you can see here how we used, how we actually came up with our calculations. So the cost of completed in the July 1st work in process is 6,675. Started and completed is to 79,800. And there is the amount that is transferred out. And there's the total assignment of the cost assigned by the mixing department. Okay. All right. So that concludes the review or discussion, at least first presentation of Objective 2 in this chapter. I know this stuff is tough. It's not supposed to be easy. So let's take a look at exercise 124 and let's take a look at exercise 125. And then we'll stop here, and the rest of the stuff I'll leave towards our class. So let's take a look at exercise 5. Cost of materials transferred into the filling department of Lilac Skincare is $20,250. The conversion cost is $6,372. And they've actually given us, they made it simple for us. They actually gave us the equivalent units, which we calculated earlier. So they gave us the equivalent units. And all they want us to do is to determine the direct materials and conversion costs per equivalent unit. So with regard to materials, you take the total materials cost of 20,250, divide by the equivalent units, which is 45,000. And with regard to conversion costs, you take the total conversion cost of 6,372 and divide by the equivalent units of 42,000. So there's your conversion cost. So for materials, it's 45 cents. And as far as conversion costs, it's 15 cents. Now, next one here, and the last one that we'll do, the cost per equivalent unit of direct materials and conversion costs in the filling department of Lilac. So they've already given us the cost, 45 and 15. We actually calculated it up above, but they made it simple for us and gave it to us again. And we've already gone ahead and computed the equivalent units. So what they want us to do is they tell us the beginning work in process had a cost of 2,200, determine the cost of completed and transferred out production, the ending work in process, and the total cost assigned by the filling department. So what we need to do to get our total costs here, we've got to consider the beginning inventory. We've got to consider what additional costs were added to that. So we got to get the total cost of the completed from beginning work in process. Then we got to figure out what the started and completed was this period, allocate those costs. And then we got to figure out what the ending work in process is, and we've got to allocate that as well. I'm going to do that using using two things. We're going to use the equivalent units, and we're going to use the conversions. So again, struggle with that on your own. And come back, and only after you struggle on your own, come back and look at the answer. So beginning work in process, we had $2,200 worth of costs. We added, it was 1,200 units that we had to add to those. See, here's the equivalent units here, 1,200. All the equivalent units are given right above here. So we added 1,200 in terms of conversion costs. There's my little table down there. 1,200 times 15 cents gives me 180. Right, so there's the cost of completed in work in process. Started and completed, we had 38,800 units. So 45 cents with regard to materials, 15 cents with regard to conversion costs. That's how I get the 17,460 and the 5,820. And then as far as the ending work in process, fully complete with regard to materials. So the 6,200 there. And conversion costs, it's 2,480. So you multiply 6,200 times 45 cents. You multiply 2,480 times 15 cents is 372. So there is the completed and transferred out production, and there is the ending work in process. Okay, so those two there equal to 28,822. So we're going to stop there. So what I'm assuming when we get to class on Thursday, that you've watched both of these little mini videos. You've tried the exercises, and we'll pick up on Thursday with the rest of chapter 2. We'll do a quick review of the production report, and then we'll get into the rest of the chapter. Right? Until the snow stops, and I see you on Thursday. Enjoy your day of quiet reflection and watching videos, and we will see you on Thursday. Be well, everybody.